Today we're reading a recent offering from Rewire News written by Jessica Porton. Keep in mind, while we're looking at this, that at the bottom of the article there is a statement about the website. Evidence-based journalism is the foundation of democracy. While it sounds like a nice sentiment, and certainly a free and truthful press is important to democracy, I would be willing to postulate that the foundations of democracy are based on the will of the demos, or the people to rule themselves, or some such quaint notion this site seems to be unaware of. Rewire News is devoted to evidence-based reporting on reproductive and sexual health rights and justice, and the intersection of race, environmental, immigration, and economic justice. Let's see just how evidence-based their social justice journalism is, shall we? No, the future is not female. It's non-binary. This popular motto is supposed to be a statement about women's rising power, but this framing feeds into gender binaries that feminists must discard. The future is female. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Nice ring? I guess it would if the world you're looking forward to is dominated by one sex. Something we're told by third-wave intersectional feminists is a bad thing. Of course, it's only terrible if the men are ruling the planet, but it's just fine if the ladies are in charge. Am I right? You can find it in cute, curvy writing on coffee mugs or written in bold font on trendy t-shirts. I find that amusing, since the only place I've only rarely seen this so-called motto is online, never in real life. She goes on to describe herself. I am a white, heterosexual woman who was assigned female at birth and has birthed 2 children. By conventional definitions, I fall very hard within racial, sexual, and gender binaries. This last sentence represents identity politics at its most obscene. It has become almost impossible to distinguish parodies from real writing these days. It is also quite normal for those on the regressive left to actively try to undo decades of hardship and sacrifice made by civil rights pioneers by placing such importance on pointing out how different we are, or others are, to each other. Instead of identifying as a person who has these interests or has achieved something meaningful, they want to reduce us to a set of labels. I'm not supposed to care about binaries because my own identities seem so clear and aligned with norms, but identity is never clear or automatic. This may be the case. However, the identitarians want to label people with characteristics that they have no control over. Silly things like sex, skin color goes completely contrary to the teaching of the giants who fought for us to be judged only on our character, something we have complete control over. These people have lost their way. The more I understand that, the more I try to raise children to be who they are. The more I'm bothered by the future is female. I know it's supposed to be a forward-looking slogan that envisions a time where all women were given our due in politics and culture. I would be interested in precisely who would be giving women their due in politics and culture, since you want to earn it instead of waiting around for the white cis-het male patriarchy to bestow these gifts upon you, right? But the statement reinforces some very backward ideologies. With colonialization came the enforcement of sex, gender, and sexuality binaries, and fierce attempts to erase cultures, like many in the Americas and Africa, that recognize gender identities and presentations outside of a binary, something that white Europeans couldn't fathom. Whiteness, binaries, and oppression go together. Black, white, male, female, gay, straight, the list goes on and on. The unintended irony of this obsession with binaries is not lost on those who are outside of this bubble. This talk of enforcement of binaries is absurd. Jessica Porton puts quite a bit of energy into shoving herself and others into binaries, although she doesn't mention who it is that is responsible for all this colonialism and binary enforcement. We of course know the culprit. It's the usual suspect. The evil white male European was indeed responsible for much colonization in the past. She and her ilk somehow seem to overlook the 1,000+ years of brutal colonization by the Islamic Caliphate. And although we no longer have the Ottoman empires, etc., repressing and brutally enslaving people, their legacy lives on strong in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Central Asia. While the authoritarian left puts much stock into how terrible Western democracies are, they fail to point out that nowhere in the world, At any time have people been more free to live the lives they desire, express themselves in any way they see fit, and most importantly, to dissent from mainstream society without fear of repression. These freedoms enjoyed by the very people who shit on the West are not to be had for hundreds of millions of people who are locked in a world of enforced Islamic ideology. Yes, we know the evils of Europe colonizing Africa and other places, which pretty much ended about 100 years ago. The same cannot be said for the Islamic culture colonization of the West, by flooding places like Sweden, the UK, and France, places that are at the heart of a free society, flooding them with people who do not subscribe to those very freedoms and seek to impose their barbaric and backwards ideology on those who have sought to create a society of equals. But recognizing that human biology doesn't operate under binaries isn't just a cultural perspective. It's backed up by science's old guard, which tends to ignore evidence that sex and gender have never been either-or propositions. Women who have only one chromosome, a single X, aren't any less female or women than I am. Neither do people with XY combo have to be female or subscribe to any gender. That last part makes no sense. I'm assuming it's a typo. Well, so much for evidence-based journalism. If gender and binaries are social constructs or just cultural perspectives, then it makes the entire conversation meaningless. Think about it for a minute. Are there species of fungi that have more than two sexes? People aren't fungus, you dim bulb. Human beings have two sexes. There is a biological reason for this. Prokaryotes, such as bacteria and archaea, are unicellular organisms that divide and do not have sexes because they do not have sex. Read a biology book if you want more details. Humans are mammals and are made up of eukaryotic cells, and due to the energetic nature of complex life, have two sexes. Humans pass DNA to their offspring, half from the mother and half from the father. Notice that nowhere in any biology textbook, old or new guard as she puts it, does anyone that I'm aware of tell us about DNA being passed on 25% each between four sexes. So you got 1/4 from the mother, 1/4 from the father, 1/4 from some other sex, and 1/4 from the other sex that we don't know about. It is important to note that mitochondrial DNA is passed on only from the female of our species, not from some third or fourth sex, and there is a good reason for this. Organelles from more than one sex contained within our cells would compete with each other. Not only would this be a waste of energy, but would put the cell at risk if there was more than one type inside it. Now I ask you to think this one through. Why is it that the female mitochondrial DNA is passed on and not some other? Give up? That being said, we could skip the next paragraph as it is all biological nonsense about intersex and rare mutations. While the condition of intersex is real, it is not the rule, but the exception. These rare conditions continue to be rare since it is often tied to the inability to conceive, and therefore those genes are less likely to be passed on. The word female is still invoked as the scientific definition of a biological woman, which incorrectly conflates sex and gender and erases the identities of intersex and non-binary people. Scientific definitions of a female are the same as the ordinary use of the word. A female and a female alone can conceive and carry, then of course give birth to another human. It's really that simple. There is no conflation, correct or incorrect. You are free, in the West at least, to identify as any gender you damn well please. But only an adult human female is capable of carrying and delivering a child into this world. The simple fact that men cannot become pregnant and women can does not erase anyone. This whole notion of erasing people is bizarre. Life is not some futuristic sci-fi movie where you can be erased like memory on a hard drive. If you exist, then you do so. Stop this madness, I ask you. And this definition isn't just propagated by right-wing anti-trans politicians. Some self-proclaimed feminist movements like gender-critical radical feminists, also known as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs, or the so-called anti-abortion feminists, also use this definition of what it means to be a woman. How either group can call themselves feminist with their narrow ideas of womanhood and stances against reproductive rights, I don't know. Now that we've breached the subject of what is expected from feminists, let's peek into the world of trans activism. In this world, it is okay for a man who identifies as a woman to tell another woman, a biological woman, that if they don't have sex with a woman with a penis, yes, you heard that right, if they don't, then they're transphobic. So the ladies who do not prefer the delights of the male sex organ and would prefer the company of other ladies, wink wink, know what I mean, are now obligated to have sex with men who say they are women. Don't get me wrong, if you want to be a trans woman, then knock your socks off. We see on places like Twitter, trans women telling biological women, if you don't like trans women and their penises, they can, and I quote, suck my dick. Well, that doesn't sound very feministy to me. I do want to point out how badly this evidence-based reporting is going here. She says that while we can point the finger at these groups, there's just as much work to do in feminist circles that believe in real gender justice. Circles that should know that genes do not make gender. I do agree with the genes gender thing. Elsewhere in this article, she says, neither do we know if there is any correlation between chromosomal makeup and non-binary gender or sexuality. I have to apologize here for wanting a bit more from this highly scientifical journal, but aren't genes closely associated with chromosomes? Asking for a friend. We can't embrace a pithy but exclusionary slogan, even one that asserts that we need more non-man in leadership, especially non-white and non-straight ones. Well then, you can't get much more radical and exclusionary than non-men, non-white, and non-straight. But this vision of female identity promotes not just a sex binary, it also assumes that all women are working towards the same future without glass ceilings and true autonomy. As our elections keep telling us over and over again in the United States, there are countless women, the majority of whom are white, who side with men in power, mobilize and vote in ways that literally harm vulnerable populations like trans people, immigrants, and women as a whole. This religion of third-wave feminism and identity politics says that women who have agency, who in this case vote as they please, are not really in control of their own thoughts and actions. Rather, they are mere puppets of the patriarchy. What is worse is this line of thinking leads to equally disturbing conclusions. You, women, may not act in a way that we, the high priestesses of intersectionality, disapprove of. Therefore, you must then surrender to our wishes and do as we command. The results may change, but the method is the same. If there were no men left on the planet, these religious fanatics would reenact The Handmaid's Tale. Only the girls would be in charge, and the rest of the girls would be enslaved. We all have moral and ethical obligations to decolonize our thoughts and language. What the hell does that even mean? Rooting out binaries that label and devalue people. You mean like this? I am a white heterosexual woman who was assigned female at birth and has birthed 2 children. By conventional definitions, I fall very hard within racial, sexual, and gender binaries. I know this crowd uses this as glorious virtue signaling, but I see this labeling that she speaks of in this very article as being harmful. They don't get it. They say, when I label and brand people by race and sex, it's just fine. But when you, the evil people, do the same thing, it is so naughty. And that includes even activist spaces, because anyone who reinforces these binaries, whether intentionally or not, is participating in upholding the oppressive institutions of a white patriarchal society. Maybe, just maybe, the future is not female. Could it be that anyone can call themselves a woman, and this may end up being enforced by law? Disagree with this at your own peril. Just ask Megan Murphy. I look at the people that are being called TERFs, and I see that I have little in common with their thinking. But they are people, as with the folks we referred to as the regressive left or SJWs. They too are people. And people can be mean. Someone was telling me about this reporting system they have on Twitter. If enough of the righteous tag an account, it goes bye-bye. What was more disturbing to me was that this dear friend seemed to think that this was a good thing. Really? Is this what the quote, good guys, unquote, are up to? Really? Reporting people who you disagree with? You want to dismantle the unjust patriarchy and replace it with one that is just as bad or worse than the one you object to. Think about it. Goodbye.